Hello and welcome to Beyond GDP, the Social Progress Podcast, where we're talking to all the smartest, most interesting people in the world about how do we build societies that serve people and planet. And I'm delighted that in today's episode, we're going to be talking about Ukraine. Why are we talking about Ukraine on the Beyond GDP podcast? Well, three reasons, I think. First of which is, this is, I think, one of the defining moral issue of our age. You have an independent country that's been invaded by an imperialist, aggressive neighbor. Ukraine's independence is something on which you can't be neutral. We have to all stand with Ukraine. That goes without saying. I think the second reason we should be talking about Ukraine is I think the outcome of this war is going to be foundational for shaping our global system going forward, depending on what the outcomes are. It's potentially helping to build a global system for the future or destructive of our global system. And the third reason I want to talk about Ukraine is because of the fact Ukraine has been such a success, a surprising success. And so I'm delighted to have with me on the podcast today Orysia Lutsevych, who is head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House, the leading global think tank, who knows all about these issues. Orysia, welcome to Beyond GDP.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and good to have this conversation with you, Michael.
I mean, let's be frank. I mean, Ukraine has had a reputation problem. Some of it, which was people didn't know what Ukraine was, which is no surprise. Russia had been spending centuries before independence and decades post-independence denying Ukraine's identity. But also it was a new country that's been trying to introduce itself to the world. It also didn't do itself a lot of favors. And I think if you pushed a lot of people, say, what do you know about Ukraine before the war, they would have said corruption. Well, but Ukraine has dazzled the world, I think it's fair to say, in the last 4 years, including Vladimir Putin, who thought he could be in Kiev within 3 days or a week and has been decisively defeated. And Ukraine has not only scored successes on the battlefield, but also there's that strong sense of the civic response within Ukraine that's impressed the world. Now, from Social Progress Index data, we've actually sort of noticed this sort of paradox for a while, that before the war, Ukraine was actually one of the most successful countries in the world. Not in terms of absolute level of social progress, but in terms of its social progress relative to its GDP per capita. There seemed to be something in Ukraine that sort of helped to drive a civic outcomes that were better than you'd expect. So Ukraine has, in some sense, introduced itself to the world for its strength as a civic society. So let's start there. Orysia, what's behind this extraordinary civic strength that Ukraine has that's now evident to the world?
It's a very important topic to start with. And just to rewind a little back, I think, Michael, not only we have the kind of a perception problem, but we fundamentally, systematically underestimated Ukraine and overestimated Russia. For obvious reasons. I think Ukraine was one of the largest unknown or misunderstood countries in Europe before the full-scale invasion. And that is why 10 years ago we started Ukraine Forum, because I, being Ukrainian myself and working a lot in a democracy development field after the collapse of the Soviet Union, saw what you saw in your Social Progress Index, that there was this enormous energy and ambition by Ukrainian people, by communities, by companies to build a different country. They were never happy with the course Ukraine was developing. And when central authorities were abusing power or stealing elections or stealing Ukraine's European future, people would take to the streets. And these were the moments when the world saw Ukraine suddenly, surprisingly. Orange Revolution, 2004, Euromaidan, or as it's called, Revolution of Dignity, 2013. And everybody was surprised. Well, I wasn't surprised, perhaps like you. And also when Russia invaded Ukraine full force in 2022, I was saying Ukraine will resist. Are we ready to back Ukraine in that resistance? And why Ukraine was so confident that it will resist is that because I think there were several factors that contributed. One, throughout the 7 years after the Revolution of Dignity, there were serious reforms that took place. Ukrainian state also strengthened. You have digitalization of services that enables you in crisis mode to sustain governance. You had the army that started building after the annexation of Crimea. You had a lot of people who went through the combat experience in 2014-15. They signed up as volunteers to defend Ukraine. You have decentralization reform that devolved powers to communities, and not only powers, but also financial resources. And finally, something you asked me about is about civil society. I think given the post-totalitarian legacy of Ukraine, Ukrainians were always a bit mistrustful of a state. And that means they were not kind of hiding away, but they were taking responsibility on their own. And they were building these horizontal networks of solidarity, if you want, across different sectors. You would have school parents organizing for supporting well-being in the concrete school. You would have journalists organizing to combat censorship and disinformation. You would have community leaders having a horizontal connection on how best to manage waste management or provide services to disabled. And you would have also people in museums working on identity in local communities. So there was this buzzing networks of solidarity that at times of war was put to a different purpose. And we have huge number of people donating to the army, supporting concrete regiments, and taking defense in their hands, because for Ukraine, it's the war for independence.
I mean, I want to just rewind on something you said there, Orysia, which I think people who don't know Ukraine may not understand so clearly, is the number of times in the last 20 years Ukraine has had to resist Russian interference and aggression. I mean, you mentioned 2004, there was the attempt by a Russia-backed candidate to steal the election, and that was stopped by a rebellion of the people, the Orange Revolution. And then there was the attempt again by that then Russian-backed president to pull back from the agreement for a closer relationship with the European Union, that then led to the Revolution of Dignity. So the Ukrainians sort of again and again, they could so easily have slipped into the Russian orbit, and there were forces within the country under Russian influence trying to pull them there. But actually, it's Ukrainian civil society that's actually resisted that, that's really driven that. And it's that civic strength is at the core that sometimes manifests itself in service delivery, whether it's in building drones or supporting military forces, but also in the humanitarian effort in the country.
Yeah, you're right. And I think just as an interesting historic fact, we named 2 revolutions with you already that were quite successful. And this is a very important, it was always peaceful protest to defend the political and civic rights and liberties. But in 1990s, there was also a revolution that was called a revolution on the granite, because there was a hunger strike of students against the renewal of the USSR treaty that Russia, the Soviet leadership, was trying to kind of lure Ukraine into this. And the young people went on this hunger strike, and actually it led one of the reasons that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, because Ukraine from that moment said, no, we want to be independent and we will fight for that independence. So yes, there's a long tradition of resistance just in the modern history, if you take.
And let's remind ourselves that there was a referendum on Ukrainian independence in those early days, and that every region of Ukraine, including Crimea, including the Donbass, voted for independence at that time. So there's no division within Ukraine behind that aspiration of independence. Okay, we've seen the successes of Ukraine, but let's talk a bit about the challenges. This is a long war. It's a hard war. I mean, is Ukrainian resistance weakening? Are people getting exhausted? What's the mood of the country now?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. to answer, I go to Ukraine about 4 times a year, and I went from the beginning of the invasion. And of course, I see the change of a mood. It's almost like mood swings. At the beginning, it was huge anxiety and I would say even like fear. Will Ukraine be able to cope, given that nobody outside of Ukraine wanted very much to support Ukraine's resistance? People forget that now, especially in the non-Western world, countries think that the West was always with Ukraine, always ready to provide armaments. But actually, the West was giving Ukraine 4 days and didn't even want to involve themselves much, including the frontline states on the eastern flank of NATO. So there was a lot of fear, but Ukraine made it through the first weeks and months of war. Then it successfully repelled Russia from Kiev and liberated almost 50% of the territory that they took, including the largest oblast city, Kherson. And there was a moment when there was confidence that Ukrainians can push Russia out of its territory completely around the summer offensive. That actually didn't materialize for various reasons, including something we forget, which is the Russian exploded one of the largest dams in Europe, or maybe in the world, the Kakhovka Dam, to slow down Ukraine's advance on the land during the summer when the soil was hard and Ukrainians could use armored vehicles. They created the soggy marshes where it was not possible to actually maneuver with equipment. And then there was lost kind of hope that Crimea will be liberated soon, and people started getting to believe that this war may last long, that this is not going to be easy and fast. And when Russia started bombing Ukrainian energy grid last year, and now, especially in a very systemic and vicious way this year, with electricity shortages, with difficulties, if you live on a 15th floor in a high rise, to go up and down, and shops running on generators and prices going up, and everybody has somebody who is wounded or dead. It gets under people's skin. But I would say people are not ready to capitulate. This bombing of cities and infrastructure doesn't mean Ukrainians are ready to accept Putin's terms. They understand that if Russia gets what it wants, and it means control over all of Ukraine, it's not about territory of a few villages, then Ukrainians will stop existing as a nation. This war has this genocidal undertone where Russia destroys everything Ukrainian, burns books, bombs museums, forbids the study of Ukrainian language and history on occupied territories. They understand that they have no choice but to resist, but to scrape all the resources that there are, human, financial, and to keep challenging Russia on the battlefield, keep denying Putin his victory, and keep, I would say, keep sustaining this coalition of European states, now more than America, to provide assistance to this battle. So I would say this is how it looks. It's exhaustion, but it's still a quite strong perseverance and resolve to defeat Russia in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the way that Russia has prosecuted this war with the appalling atrocities, the genocidal intent, has made clear what the cost of defeat would be, that must have galvanized and cemented Ukrainian will to fight against what's going on. I suppose one of the questions people have been asking at the moment is, something that could be undermining some of the confidence, not in the justice of the cause, but in the government itself, is corruption. And there have been some quite public cases about corruption recently. And that, of course, is a problem with a historic legacy. So what is the story around corruption in Ukraine? And what's the direction?
Yeah, before the full-scale invasion, there was a saying in Ukraine that Ukraine is fighting two enemies. One is external, which is Russia, and one is internal, which is corruption. And there's very strong awareness that corruption is also an existential threat to Ukrainian state, because it washes away resources for prosperity, for defense, for support of the vulnerable groups. I almost felt Ukraine is very rich country in terms of all kinds of resources, minerals, oil and gas, people, grain, metallurgy. It should be, more prosperous than Poland, but it was always 4 times poorer than Poland, and now it's much more poor than Poland. It's the second poorest country after Moldova in Europe. It was the case even before the full-scale invasion, because a big share of a shadow economy to a degree, and also because of the inefficiencies and corrupt practices within the system. But after the Revolution of Dignity, there was a big progress. And I think the fact that today we can read in frontline, in front pages of both Ukrainian and international news about the corruption scandal in the energy agency, Atomic Energy Agency, the administrator of nuclear power stations, the big state-owned company, it's actually a sign that what Ukraine has set up in the last 10 years, this independent anti-corruption prosecution, it pays off because it exposes corruption. It is independent. It can it can run and implement very complex, because let's remember, all this financial crime and anti-corruption, it's global. It's very difficult to find evidence for that, and the schemes are very elaborate to hide traces of this money laundering. So National Anti-Corruption Bureau is trying to basically return money to Ukrainian budget that was stolen, and it's quite successfully doing it. It has done throughout the last 4 years, returned over 300 million British pounds, so roughly that amount. But it's an uphill struggle because of the entrenched system of, we call it crony capitalism, where there's a fusion between politics, justice, and economy. And with a big share of state-owned enterprises, they serve like a cash cows for this kind of shadow politics. And this is very hard to dismantle, but because Ukrainian society puts huge pressure, I think Zelensky has to take it very, very seriously. Otherwise, this will completely undermine all of his political dividend created by a successful resistance to Russian aggression.
Yeah, there's kind of a moment here, you feel, when President Zelensky has to show that decisive leadership, and that confidence is essential for that, especially because of the sort of foreign aid that's being invested, which, as you said, is not enough, but I think people are conscious of the political support for that.
Yeah, but just to remind our listeners that Ukraine relies a lot on foreign aid, because if you look at Ukrainian fiscal revenues, Ukraine spends everything that it collects in taxes and duties for the armed forces. So everything that's related to payments to teachers, healthcare, electricity for schools, all of this has to be covered by Western donors. And on top of that, military equipment for air defense and for battlefield artillery, helicopters, airplanes, all of this has to be. So Ukraine is very dependent on Western assistance.
Now, look, you're at Chatham House, an international affairs think tank. So I want to step back a moment and think about what the implications of this conflict are for the global system. I mean, Ukraine, the Revolution of Dignity was sparked around Ukraine's desire to be closer to Europe. We always must remind people that the Ukraine didn't have a NATO aspiration until it was invaded by Russia, but there is now the NATO aspiration. So Ukraine's geopolitical trajectory is quite clear, but then we're thinking about, well, where's the UN been in this whole story? The fact that you've got the invading state, Russia, sitting there on the Security Council of the UN, I think is an open sore within the UN system. What does this conflict mean for the reshaping of the global system in the 21st century?
Yeah, it's a big question you're asking, and I think that's the nature of your podcast, I guess, to think big. I would say this conflict, this war, is about it touches upon every nation in the world, because Russia attacks at the core the Ukraine's aspiration to be independent, to be sovereign, fully sovereign nation. Like there's Portugal and there's Argentina, and they are sovereign nations. They can decide whether they belong to NATO, belong to EFTA, belong to NAFTA, which alliances they choose, right? Nobody should dictate to sovereign nations how they arrange their relationship for security, for economy, how they arrange at home their memory policy, their language policy. There are some normative rules within different traditions, different political cultures, but it's up to these nations to decide. And this is why I think the danger comes now with these strong men in power in China, in Russia, and even in the United States, that believe fundamentally that some countries should have limited sovereignty, that they have the right to interfere in affairs in a different way in their regions, in the neighboring countries, using different tools, economic, disinformation, corruption, purchasing elites, and that it's okay. And Ukraine, by mounting this resistance, says, no, it's not okay. And we should all appreciate what Ukraine is doing for the world, especially for non-nuclear countries, and Ukraine being a country that gave up its nuclear weapons in 1994 in exchange, actually, of security assurances that countries like Russia will not invade Ukraine and violate its sovereignty and territorial integrity. If Ukraine fails and Russia prevails in Ukraine, we will have a cascading effect of other countries who believe they are entitled to control their neighbors, their regions, and UN has already proven itself bankrupt in a way in many cases, but in Ukraine in particular, where you have a large nuclear power member of the Security Council attacking another large, also sovereign country in Europe. I would like to speak in defense of UN one thing where I think the General Assembly has proven itself in a more positive way than the Security Council and has passed several critical resolutions, both the right at the start of the invasion for Russia to stop the war and withdraw from Ukraine, later on for the compensation of the victims of invasion, that there should be reparations that Russia must pay. And UN has documented all these war crimes and outrageous acts of violence that Russian army is performing against Ukrainian civilians on occupied territories that amount to war crimes. And it's important to document this for, I guess, also for Russia itself and for its people to understand that this should not be repeated, that this is not a just cause, that this is unprovoked invasion. But I think we are facing right now a battle about how we organize the world, as simple as that, and whether there will be any rules at all, and whether these rules will be respected and enforced.
You made me think of, of course, another country that was a victim of Russian imperialism in the past was Poland, which, of course, was part of the Russian Empire till it gained its independence in 1918. And the Polish freedom fighters used to talk about for your freedom and ours. And essentially that is what Ukraine's cause is now, because Ukraine is standing up for the rights of sovereign nations under international law. And if we allow international law to slip and that to mean nothing, then that will affect other countries as well.
And what's interesting, just to also highlight a few other very dangerous kind of precedents that Russia is trying to set, Ukraine is trying to resist. The use of food as a weapon. We know how important Ukraine's grain is for the world. The use of energy as a weapon. It's the first conflict where a nuclear power station is used hostage and is constantly threatened. An accident and radiation contamination for the whole of Europe. And an international atomic agency is is rather powerless to actually enforce demilitarized zone or take this under its operation, for example, during the time of war. So it touches upon many. And lastly, I must mention Ukrainian deported children that Russia violated all the international law, moved them to Russia, destroyed all the records. Now it's turning these children into Russians, and then they militarize it to fight against Ukraine or against Europeans. So there are lots of very dangerous precedents.
Orysia, there's so much we could talk about. I always press my guests to give me a prediction. Give me a prediction. About anything you like. Give me a prediction about the future. And while you think about that, I've got one other question I want to ask you after that is, obviously we stand with Ukraine. What can listeners do to support Ukraine? That's my second question.
Right. Well, the prediction, I guess think tanks are wrong places for those. We've seen experts often giving wrong predictions. Look, I think my prediction is the following, that Ukraine will turn the tide this winter. Ukraine will persevere this winter, and it's Ukrainian courage that will mobilize Europe to defend itself, first of all, and to mobilize resources necessary to stabilize Ukraine and possibly over time turn this war in its favor, because this is our homeland security at risk. If again Russia prevails in Ukraine, we will spend exponentially more on defense. And I think the fact that America, and we didn't talk about Trump, and my prediction that Trump will keep getting Putin wrong. We cannot rely on actually Trump persuading Putin to stop the war. This has been my prediction is that he will continue on the wrong trajectory, and Putin will keep overreaching, will also keep making mistakes, and this will not end well for Russia. And all these economic sanctions and battlefield losses will eventually destabilize the system inside Russia, that it will not be able to wage the war for too long.
I mean, just as a note, one thing that's always been clear from Social Progress Index data is whereas Ukraine was doing a good job of turning its GDP to social progress, Russia was the opposite. And I think the weakness of social outcomes, civic institutions in Russia is something that drags on them. And I think that's going to be a problem, and there's a fundamental weakness there. But that's for another day. Supporting Ukraine. I'm a big fan. There's a United 24, the president of Ukraine's platform, where you can very easily donate money and the Ukrainian government gets to decide where it goes. Any thoughts on advice to people on how to support Ukraine?
Well, I think what is important right now and how people can show solidarity with Ukraine is to remain interested. And one project that I would support is Ukraine in the World. It's a podcast that's run by a group of journalists that you will hear direct voices from Ukraine, people being on the ground. You can support them through Patreon and through PayPal, and I think that's important. There are also good initiatives to support the work with Ukrainian children, but I don't remember now the name. So maybe we skip that part. We'll just keep the podcast.
Orysia Lutsevych, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. And most importantly, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. We download.